Hello, everybody, and welcome back to World Talks, where every word matters. My name is Don Arleth. Now, Kamala Harris is set to make one of the most consequential decisions of her career today, and that is choose a running mate who will accompany her for the next 91 days of the presidential campaign. About a dozen candidates were interviewed over the last few days, but experts believe that the choice is down to just 3 or perhaps even 2, according to that recent Reuters report. So Arizona Senator Mark Kelly, Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. And now joining me to discuss is Jason Steinhauer, author and public historian. Hello, and thanks for joining us on World Talks.
Thanks for having me.
So, well, based on the information coming out, it seems like the choice may have just been narrowed down to just 2 candidates, and that being either Shapiro or Walz. So, in your opinion, who do you think will Vice President Kamala Harris pick, and who would be a good pick for Vice President for Kamala Harris?
Yeah, great questions. I am not privy to any inside information from the Harris campaign, so I can't break any news on the program. I think part of this depends on how you look at the electoral map and how the Democratic Party is looking at the electoral map. Pennsylvania figures to be a crucially important state for getting to the magic number of 270. Ohio also promises to be a crucial state. Former President Trump has chosen J.D. Vance in the hopes that that will shore up a victory in Ohio. So I would not be surprised if Vice President Harris opts to select for the governor from Pennsylvania in order to try and shore up that critical state and its electoral votes. In terms of policy, the vice presidential pick doesn't move the needle all that much when it comes to policy, both during the election as well as once in office. So I think this is probably a calculation just based on where the party thinks it can strengthen its hand a little bit more, leading into a very tight final stretch run.
Some say that Governor Shapiro would be somewhat of a liability due to, well, his support for Israel and especially in the war in Gaza. Will that be an issue for Democrats who are voting during these elections with that particular issue in mind?
Well, again, I think the most important aspect of this is the electoral map. I really can't stress enough for your viewers and listeners how important Pennsylvania is with its electoral votes as a swing state for ultimately deciding who will win in November. Certainly, the Democratic Party has tried to walk a very delicate line when it comes to the Israel-Gaza issue. There are many inside the Democratic Party who are not pleased with the way the Biden administration has handled the conflict. At the same time, there are factions within the party who support President Biden and Vice President Harris's approach to the issue and are very alarmed and concerned at the anti-Semitism that we're seeing in the United States and around the world. So I believe they've tried to walk a careful line of advocating for a ceasefire while also condemning anti-Semitism. And I suspect that whoever the vice presidential candidate is on the ticket will also walk that line.
Now, concerning Central and Eastern Europe, that's what really interests us. We have 2 very different candidates in the running. What do you think a Trump victory would mean for our region, Central and Eastern Europe, and what would a Harris administration look like for Central and Eastern Europe?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's obviously hard to predict the future. I think critically for Central and Eastern Europe, the big question is Ukraine and the Russian invasion. I think one of the major questions facing the United States and the world is how will this play out in the next year, 2 years, maybe even beyond that. What does it mean for security issues? What does it mean for the future of NATO? And what does it mean for hopefully deterring Russian aggression and bringing an end to the horrific conflict? President Trump, Vice President candidate Vance, some Republicans in Congress have come out as skeptical of the United States' continued support of Ukraine and also have come out as skeptical in continuing to fund NATO at the levels that it's currently being funded by the US. So there are potentially big consequences for the November election in regards to security. It's important to note, though, that Congress actually recently passed a provision that would give the Senate ultimate approval over whether the United States could withdraw from the NATO treaty. So that builds a few more safeguards into the process. And of course, under a Harris administration, one would expect that some of the policies that have currently been in place would continue, but of course, it also depends on what happens with Congress. And so we have to watch carefully what happens in the House and the Senate of the United States, because if Republicans win the House and the Senate, even if Harris wins the White House, there still could be some difficult politics to navigate in terms of continued Ukraine funding and continued security issues.
Right now, when we look at the polls, the latest polls, it's still, again, it's looking like a coin toss here. The election's coming up in November. What do you think are going to be the most important elements which influence either candidate's success in this race in the upcoming 91 days, I believe it is?
Well, turnout is always a huge question in U.S. presidential politics as well as in congressional politics. Each side is doing the best that it can to rally its base and ensure that those who are committed to voting or likely to vote will turn out on Election Day. The Harris campaign has benefited from some renewed enthusiasm and renewed energy over the past few weeks, and I think the Trump campaign has as well, especially in the aftermath of the assassination. As horrible and tragic as that was, it did give a jolt to both the Republican convention as well as to Republican fundraising and Republican mobilization. So I think both sides are very motivated right now. The bases are very motivated. There's a lot of energy and effort going into voter turnout. And then I think there will obviously be important issues on the table for the American people to think about over the next 3 months, including questions around foreign policy, questions around domestic policy, questions around the economy and inflation, and questions around abortion and reproductive freedom.
If we look at the, if we look at the voter turnout, I mean, it's really going to boil down to who is more motivated, right? Who sees their candidate as someone that they can go and stand in line for maybe a couple hours to vote for. In this particular moment in the race, who do you think holds the advantage, or does either candidate hold the advantage? Is there one in particular, or neither?
Well, these moments are so fleeting in American politics. I think right now, August probably belongs to the Democrats and the Harris campaign. There's been a surge of enthusiasm, particularly from voters of color, minority populations, and younger voters around the Harris campaign. The enthusiasm for electing a woman of color, for electing the first woman president of the United States in our history. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm around that. And of course, we have the convention coming up. So the Republicans got a huge boost of enthusiasm and media coverage around their convention. We would expect the same to happen in mid-August for the Democratic convention. But a lot can happen between now and November. So while the Democrats may have the momentum right now and the media attention right now, that can change very quickly, especially as events continue to unfold, both domestically and internationally.
If we assume that the choice is down to just Shapiro and Governor Walz, does it really matter who Kamala Harris picks for Democratic voters?
It's a fair question. There's not a ton of evidence that the vice presidential pick actually moves the needle all that much. I think anecdotally, maybe you could say that even sometimes a vice presidential candidate can maybe hurt a little bit. But I think ultimately this will come down to Harris and Trump, not the vice presidential picks. And I think it will come down to how well Democrats and Republicans can mobilize their voters to show up at Election Day, how well they can sway independent voters in key swing states to believe that they have a vision for the country moving forward. And I think ultimately it will also come down to fundraising and mobilization of those resources and how well the parties are able to use the war chest that they've assembled in order to get boots on the ground in key states, bring people to the polls, and run targeted ads both on social media and in traditional media in order to reach voters across the country. The United States is a big place, 340 million people. It takes a lot of resources to get people awake, mobilized, and ready to vote. So we'll see who can mobilize those resources best over the next few months. That will probably make the difference, less so than who is the vice presidential pick for Vice President Harris.
Right. Well, at the current moment, Kamala Harris seems to be winning the race as far as raising funds. She outraised in July former President Trump, almost doubling what he brought in. So I guess also for our viewers, how can you put this in context? How important is the money that both of these campaigns raise? How important is that for the outcome of the elections?
Well, it's not a predictor. Certainly in 2016, Hillary Clinton's campaign raised more money and spent more money than Donald Trump's campaign, and Donald Trump still won the presidency. But presidential elections and congressional elections are increasingly expensive in the United States. The 2020 election was over a $1 billion election, and I expect 2024 to be the same, if not more. It's expensive to assemble teams who can work across swing states, knocking on doors, registering voters, and mobilizing people in communities across a very large country of over 3,000 miles from end to end. And it costs money to run advertisements in key states. And especially for the Harris campaign, Vice President Harris is at this point a well-known political figure, but there's a segment of the US population that doesn't know much about her record, what she has done in California, what she has done in the Senate, what she has done as vice president. So there needs to be an active campaign to raise awareness about where she stands on issues and what her track record is. She can't simply rest on being vice president. And so that will require resources. So these funds that are coming in now, a lot of Democratic donors getting off the sidelines as a result of the changing candidate, this is going to be critical for her over the next month or two to really make her case to the American people about who she is and what she stands for.
Jason Steinhauer, author and public historian, thank you very much for sharing your insights on this very interesting race as it pans out. We still have about 3 months to go, so hope to have you in again. Thank you very much for joining us.
Happy to join anytime. Thanks very much.
And that concludes this edition of World Talks. Thanks for joining us, and stay with us for more here on TVP World.